Evelyn Harper stood in the doorway, the cold seeping into her skin, but it was not the weather that sent the shiver down her spine. It was the eyes of the man before her, Silas Harper, her late husband's brother. Hard, flat, and devoid of mercy. "You'll leave," he said, his voice as dry as the dust at his boots. "Tonight." Behind him, his wife Margaret clutched her shawl, her lips pressed into a thin, unsympathetic line. She would not argue, nor would she plead Evelyn's case. That much was clear. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her shawl, the only thing of value she had left. "This is my home," she whispered, though she already knew the words meant nothing. "Was," Silas corrected. He took a slow step forward, his presence blotting out the weak light of the lantern hanging from the porch. "My brother is dead. I got my own kin to think of, my own boys to feed. You ain't blood." Her children, Caleb and Anna, stood behind. Their small hands grasping at her skirts. Caleb, 8 years old and already too aware of the world's cruelty, lifted his chin, defiant. "Pa built this house." Silas's jaw flexed, his hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip. A movement so slight that only a practiced eye would have caught it. Evelyn did, and she knew that if she pressed further, if she made herself a problem, he would solve her as easily as putting a bullet in a sick horse. "Don't make this harder," Margaret murmured, glancing toward the shuttered window as if, fearful the neighbors might hear. "A woman alone, you know how things go." Evelyn swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 3 months, killed by bandits on the trail back from Abilene. She had mourned, grieved in silence, held her children when they asked why he wasn't coming home. She had believed that Silas would do right by them. She had been wrong. "You have until sundown," Silas said, turning on his heel, already done with her existence. The sound of the door slamming shut was a punctuation mark, a death knell. Caleb pulled on her sleeve, his blue eyes wide with anger. "We ain't leaving." Evelyn crouched, smoothing his hair back with trembling fingers. "We don't have a choice." Anna, only 5, clung to her mother's side, her breath warm against Evelyn's shoulder. "Where will we go?" She didn't have an answer. As the last of the daylight faded, she gathered what little she could. A threadbare blanket, a canteen, a small satchel of biscuits Margaret had begrudgingly shoved at her before turning away. Not enough, not nearly enough. But there was no time. Silas had made it clear. He wouldn't wait until morning. The children walked in silence as they left the only home they had ever known. The dirt road stretched ahead of them, winding into the dark unknown, the vast emptiness of the frontier pressing in from all sides. By the time the house was no more than a flickering light behind them, the temperature had dropped sharply. The wind cut through Evelyn's shawl, her breath a thin mist in the frigid air. The children huddled close, their steps uneven from exhaustion. "We need to find shelter," she murmured, scanning the land. A shadowed tree line stood a mile ahead, offering the only semblance of safety. She tightened her grip on Caleb's hand. "Come on." They reached the trees as night swallowed the land whole. Evelyn stumbled through the underbrush, her legs numb, her mind clouded with exhaustion and the gnawing fear that she had led them to their deaths. Then through the dim light of the rising moon, she spotted a hollowed-out tree trunk, just large enough for them to squeeze inside. She pushed the children in first, curling around them as best she could. Caleb shivered violently, his body pressed against hers, while Anna tucked herself beneath the blanket, her small frame barely stirring. The silence of the night settled heavily, broken only by the whispering wind and the distant cry of some unseen predator. Evelyn forced herself to stay awake, listening, waiting. Then she heard it, a rustle in the undergrowth. Her breath stilled. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying for shelter. Something, or someone, was out there. She tightened her grip on the small hunting knife tucked into her bodice, her fingers slick with sweat despite the cold. Another sound, this time a footstep, slow, measured. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Caleb stirred slightly, his head lifting from her shoulder. "Mama," he whispered. Evelyn pressed a finger to his lips, willing him into silence. Shadow passed through the trees. Tall, broad, moving with the surety of a predator. A man. Not Silas. Not one of his men. This was someone else. The figure stopped just beyond the tree line, his outline barely visible against the night. He stood, there for what felt like eternity, unmoving, watching. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the darkness. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. She did not sleep. The morning was brittle with frost, the air sharp enough to cut. Evelyn's limbs ached from the cold, her body stiff from a night spent curled around her children in the hollow of a tree. Her breath came in soft, shallow puffs, her ears straining for any sound beyond the whisper of wind through the branches. The figure she had seen in the night had not returned. Not yet. Caleb stirred first, rubbing his eyes with the back of his small hand. "Mama," he murmured. She hushed him gently, pressing a finger to his lips. Anna was still curled into the crook of her arm, her little face buried against Evelyn's side. She listened. The forest had its own rhythm, its own pulse, birds stirring in the distance, the crackle of ice melting from the leaves. And then beneath it all, something else, a shift in the air, a presence. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the knife. Hidden in her skirts, a branch snapped. She turned her head sharply, her pulse hammering. A man stood at the tree line, half shrouded in shadow. He did not move, did not speak. He was not Silas, not any man she had ever seen. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick buffalo hide. His face was stark in the cold light, high cheekbones and a strong jawline half obscured by dark war paint. His hair was long, tied back with strips of leather, the ends woven with beads and feathers. A Comanche warrior. Her grip on the knife tightened. He watched her with an unreadable expression, his dark eyes shifting from her to the children pressed against her side. He took a step forward, slow, deliberate, Evelyn tensed, angling herself between him and her children. "Stay back," she said, her voice hoarse from sleep and fear. He did not stop. She raised the knife, her hand trembling. The warrior tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, in one fluid motion, he crouched, resting his forearms on his knees. He was close now, close enough that she could see the faint scars across his knuckles, the weathered leather of the knife sheath at his belt. She expected a threat, a demand. Instead, he reached into the folds of his hide and pulled out something small, a piece of dried meat. He placed it on the ground between them. Then, just as deliberately, he took a step back. Evelyn's breath came quick and uneven. She stared at the offering, suspicion tightening her chest. Caleb, still half asleep, whispered, "Who is he?" She had no answer. The warrior did not speak. His gaze remained steady, watchful. Minutes stretched long between them. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had come. Evelyn did not move, did not exhale, until the last rustle of his passing faded into the wind. She waited, tense and coiled, but he did not return. Only then did. She looked down at the small piece of dried meat resting in the dirt. Anna stirred, blinking up at her mother. "I'm hungry," she whispered. Evelyn hesitated, then picked up the offering. It was rough in her hands, tough and worn by the elements. She broke off a small piece, sniffed it cautiously. Smoked venison. The children watched her, their eyes hollow with hunger. She gave Caleb a piece first. He hesitated only a moment before shoving it into his mouth, chewing with slow deliberation. Evelyn waited, watched. When he did not fall ill, she gave Anna a piece, then, at last, took one for herself. It was the first real food they had eaten in 2 days. Evelyn forced herself to stay awake as the morning stretched on. The man had left, but she did not believe for a moment that he had simply gone. He was watching, somewhere unseen, deciding. The hours passed. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of snow. Then, just as the sun began to sink behind the trees, he returned. Evelyn heard him before she saw him. The soft crunch of boots against frost, the whisper of movement through the brush. She turned, and there he was. This time he did not stop at the tree line. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, and though her instinct screamed at her to raise the knife again, she did not. He came closer than before, his presence filling the space around them. Then he spoke. His voice was low, rough like the scrape of stone against stone. "You will die out here." The words were final, matter-of-fact. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I don't plan to." A flicker of something, amusement maybe, ghosted across his features. His gaze shifted to the children, then back to her. "You have no horse, no food. The river ahead is high from the rains." She did not respond. He studied her for a moment, longer, then reached into his hide once more. Another offering, this time a water skin. She hesitated, her pride warring with necessity, but necessity always won. She took it. He nodded once, as if some silent agreement had passed between them. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking. Not away, not back into the trees. Forward. He did not look back. Evelyn stared after him, her heart pounding. Caleb tugged at her sleeve. "Mama?" She licked her lips, her mouth dry despite the water she now held in her hands. The warrior was still moving, his steps unhurried but sure, as if he knew she would follow. She looked down at her children, then at the path ahead. The sky was darkening. The wind was shifting. She took Caleb's, and then at last she stepped forward. The journey began in silence. The warrior led, his pace steady but unhurried, his movements effortless despite the rough terrain. Evelyn followed, gripping Caleb's hand. Anna's smaller fingers curled around her wrist. The children struggled to match his long strides, but they did not complain. There was no point. They were beyond comfort now, beyond protest. Survival demanded silence. The forest thickened as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the canopy above casting shifting shadows across the frozen ground. The warrior never spoke, never glanced back, but he knew they were there. He slowed when the path grew treacherous, when sharp brambles threatened to snag Evelyn's skirts, when the roots beneath the frost turned the ground into a snare. He was not a guide. He was not a savior. He was something else. Hours passed, the sky a deepening bruise. The sun sank behind the hills and the temperature plummeted. Evelyn's breath frosted in the air, her fingers numb even beneath her shawl. Caleb stumbled. The warrior stopped. The pause was brief, barely a moment, but it was an acknowledgement. He was aware of them, aware of their weakness. He could have left them behind. He did not. They reached a river just as twilight settled into darkness. The current was fierce, swollen from distant mountain snows, its surface glinting silver in the dying light. It was no shallow stream to wade across. It was a force, alive and merciless. Evelyn's stomach clenched. She knew what was coming before the warrior turned to face her. "You cross here." His voice was as rough as the stones beneath their feet, edged with something she couldn't name. She looked at the water, at the way it twisted and churned, the deep, dark pull of it. Anna whimpered. Caleb clenched his jaw. The warrior stepped forward, reaching for the boy first. Caleb stiffened, fear flashing in his wide blue eyes. "No," Evelyn said sharply, instinct driving her between them. The warrior's gaze locked onto hers, unreadable. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply crouched and picked up a smooth, flat stone. Without breaking eye contact, he tossed it into the water. It disappeared instantly, swallowed whole. Evelyn's throat tightened. "You wait, you freeze," he said simply. "You fight, you drown." He turned back to Caleb. "Come." Caleb's hands curled into fists, but he did not move. His small chest rose and fell in quick, panicked breaths. Evelyn knelt, gripping his arms. "You listen to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You go with him. He will get you across." Caleb swallowed, his throat working. His fingers dug into her sleeves, but slowly he nodded. The warrior lifted him with ease, carrying him as if he weighed nothing. He stepped into the river. Evelyn's breath caught. The current surged around his legs, but he did not falter. His footing was sure, his movements precise. Step by step he crossed, the water rising past his waist, the cold turning his breath into mist. Then he was on the other side, placing Caleb down gently. Caleb turned, eyes wide with disbelief. He was safe. The warrior turned back. Anna trembled in Evelyn's arms. The little girl buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her breath warm but rapid. Evelyn's chest ached. She forced her feet forward, wading in. The water struck like a blade, shocking her breath from her lungs. She gritted her teeth and pushed deeper. The river pulled at her skirts, at her legs, trying to steal her footing. Anna whimpered against her chest. Evelyn tightened her grip. Halfway across, the current surged. Her feet slipped. A gasp tore from her throat as she lurched sideways, the water closing over her shoulders. Anna screamed. Evelyn flailed, struggling to find purchase, but the river had her now. It twisted her, dragged her. Then, hands. Iron fingers locked around. Her arm, pulling. A force unshakable, unyielding, yanked her free of the river's grasp. The warrior. He hauled her upward, his strength absolute, his grip unrelenting. He did not let go until she was on solid ground, gasping, shaking, Anna clinging to her like a drowning thing. Evelyn coughed, water burning in her lungs. She turned to Caleb, to Anna, running her hands over them, assuring herself they were whole. The warrior watched in silence. She met his gaze, her body still racked with tremors, and for the first time she whispered, "Thank you." He gave a single nod. The journey did not stop. The night pressed in around them, thick with unseen eyes. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Evelyn fought to keep pace, her muscles burning, exhaustion clawing at the edges of her vision. Then a sound, low, guttural, close, a growl. The warrior stopped abruptly, his posture shifting, his body going still. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Another growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. The rustle of movement, the soft crunch of paws against frozen earth. Wolves. She saw them then, yellow eyes glinting in the darkness, circling. Shadows with teeth. Anna whimpered. Evelyn pressed a hand over her mouth. The warrior moved. Fast. A blade flashed in his grip, the steel catching the moonlight. His stance was effortless, controlled, a predator facing predators. One of the wolves lunged. The warrior struck. The knife met flesh. A sharp yelp split the air. The other wolves hesitated, watching, waiting. A silent battle of wills. The warrior did not blink, did not move. Then, just as suddenly, the wolves turned and vanished into the night. Evelyn exhaled shakily. The warrior wiped his blade clean and turned. "We go." She wanted to collapse, to sleep, to break beneath the weight of everything. Instead, she followed. They walked until dawn bled across the horizon, a fragile light spilling over the endless land. The wind had quieted, the scent of frost and pine sharp in the air. At last, the warrior stopped. Ahead, nestled in the valley below, was something unexpected. Smoke curled from a hidden fire, the faint outline of shelter, of possibility, of rest. He turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You stay, or you go." It was not a command. It was not a demand. It was a choice. Evelyn looked at her children. Then, she looked at him. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight. Smoke coiled lazily from the fire pit, the scent of charred wood mixing with the crisp morning air. The shelter was little more than a collection of animal hides stretched over a crude frame, but to Evelyn it may as well have been a fortress. Her body ached, her bones felt hollow. Yet there was something else beneath the exhaustion, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. The warrior stood near the fire, his back to her, sharpening his blade with slow, practiced movements. The rhythm of stone against steel was steady, deliberate. He had not asked why she chose to stay. He hadn't needed to. Caleb and Anna huddled close, their small forms wrapped in borrowed furs. Caleb had been watching the warrior since sunrise, studying his movements, the way his hands worked with quiet precision. Evelyn saw the questions forming in his mind, but the boy remained silent. He was learning, watching. Then, the wind shifted. Sound carried with it. Hoofbeats, distant but closing in fast. The warrior lifted his head. His expression did not change, but his body tensed, muscles coiling beneath his skin like a panther poised to strike. Evelyn knew before she even turned. Silas had come. She scrambled to her feet, heart slamming against her ribs. The moment of peace had been a borrowed thing, never meant to last. The warrior stepped forward, his gaze locked on the horizon. "Stay here." Evelyn grabbed his arm before she could think better of it. "You don't know him," she whispered. He met her eyes. "And he does not know me." A shadow of something flickered across his face, something like certainty. Then he was moving. Evelyn turned to her children. "Stay hidden." She cupped Caleb's face, forcing him to look at her. No matter what happens, Caleb's lip trembled, but he nodded. She rose, hands shaking. She would not cower, not again. The riders appeared over the ridge, 5 in total. Silas rode at the front, his coat billowing behind him, the rifle at his side gleaming in the pale morning light. He pulled back on the reins, slowing his horse to a near halt, surveying the scene with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Well now," he drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "Took me longer than I thought to track you, but here we are." His gaze flicked to the warrior, lingering. He smirked. "Didn't take you for the type, Evelyn." Throwing in with, "A redskin?" The warrior did not react, his expression carved from stone. Silas sighed, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn. Thought after Thomas died you'd come to your senses. Should have known you'd need more convincing." Evelyn forced herself to step forward. "I'm not going back." Silas chuckled, dismounting his horse with practiced ease. "Oh, I ain't asking, sweetheart." His men remained mounted, hands resting on their weapons, waiting for his signal. The warrior moved then, slow and deliberate. He stepped between Evelyn and Silas, his presence a solid, immovable force. His knife glinted in the light, though he had yet to raise it. Silas arched a brow. "This how it is, then?" The warrior did not speak. Silas sighed, feigning disappointment. "Well, that's a damn shame." Then, in a blur of motion, his revolver was in his hand. The warrior moved faster. Before Silas could fire, the knife was in the air, flashing across the distance between them. It struck true, embedding deep into Silas's forearm. He howled, dropping the gun as blood splattered onto the dirt. Chaos erupted. One of Silas's men fired his rifle, the shot cracking through the valley. The warrior dove, rolling into a crouch, scooping up a handful of dirt and flinging it toward the second rider's face. The man reeled back, momentarily blinded. Evelyn lunged for the fallen revolver, fingers closing around the grip. Silas swore, yanking the knife from his arm. Blood poured freely, but his fury outweighed the pain. He turned toward Evelyn, his good hand reaching for her throat. She fired. The shot rang out, deafening. Silas staggered back, a red bloom spreading across his side. He stared at her, his mouth opening in shock, then rage. "You—" Another shot. Split the air. Caleb stood behind her, his small hands shaking around a rifle too large for him. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. The shot had gone wide, but it was enough. Silas swayed. His mouth opened as if to curse her one last time, but then he collapsed. The remaining men hesitated. Their leader was dead. The fight was over. Before it had begun, one by one they turned their horses and rode off, disappearing over the ridge, leaving only the scent of gunpowder and blood behind. Silence fell. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps. She lowered the revolver, her arms trembling, her legs threatening to give out. Caleb swallowed hard, still gripping the rifle. "Mama, I thought—" She pulled him into her arms before he could finish. "It's over." The warrior stepped forward, retrieving his knife from the ground. He wiped the blade clean on his leg, then met Evelyn's gaze. "You fought," he said simply. She exhaled. something deep and unshakable settling in her chest. Yes. He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. The valley stretched before them, untouched, unclaimed. The wind carried the scent of pine and new earth. Evelyn turned to her children, then to the warrior. "Where do we go now?" Caleb asked. She looked at the horizon, the endless road ahead. "Forward,"